Senator Lieberman, let me start with you.
Okay.
We were together in Paris this year, and I've heard you describe quite eloquently the gathering and how impressed you were, what moved you. Can you talk a little bit about your impressions from the Paris conference? And also, you've been an advocate together with I and others for Camp Liberty. Would you also talk about Paris and Camp Liberty a little bit?
It was actually an extraordinary experience for me and my wife. The first thing is, you know, I've been blessed in my life. I've been a U.S. Senator. I ran for Vice President in 2000. I spoke to very big audiences. I have never spoken to more people at once in my life than I did at that meeting in France of the National Resistance of Iran. And that was 100,000 people, and from all over the world. Obviously, probably some more proportionally from Europe, because Europe was where it was. A lot of people from America, a lot from Connecticut, but really beyond, numbers do say something, which is an expression of the global interest in this cause of a free Iran. And I was very impressed by, beyond the numbers, the substance of what was talked about. It was the first opportunity I had to meet Mrs. Rajavi. She is really a brilliant leader, very principled leader, very charismatic leader. This is a regime that says that it is religious, and yet to me, and it's expressed in our Declaration of Independence, the most profound religious belief is that we're all here not by accident, but as the creation of God. And each one of us, every person, deserves those rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and this regime every day denies those rights to its political opponents, to women, to minorities. You could go on and on. And the contrast between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the program of the national resistance, as stated by Mrs. Rajavi, was quite moving. So it was an extraordinary transformational day. Let me just say a quick word about Camp Liberty. And this is very important. I know you've done it over the years. You've got to keep doing it. So you still have, as you well know, in the government of Iran, the people who have of Iraq, the people who have responsibility for oversight of what happens at Camp Liberty are the people who are still essentially, they're very close to Iran, let's put it that way, and they're doing Iran's work. So there's another reason, of course, why America has to take the lead in protecting the people of Iran. It's because of Camp Liberty. It's because they are there and being mistreated according to every standard of human rights and decency because the United States broke a promise to them that if they gave up their weapons and left Ashraf and went to Camp Liberty, we would protect them. We haven't. And, you know, the more I follow and I've been involved in foreign policy, the more I feel like the best foreign policy is the policy that you and I would follow in our lives and want to follow in our lives. We're loyal to our friends. We know who our enemies are, and we're cautious with them. We'd like them to become our friends, but we're not going to sacrifice our friends for that. And when we make a promise, we keep it.
Jack, let me ask you about promises, commitments that we as a U.S. government, when we were still in government, we exhorted the MEK at Ashraf to give up their weapons in exchange for our security. And over time, we abrogated that promise. What do you see as kind of the U.S.'s obligation to the continuing obligation to those that we left behind without the security with the Iraqi regime?
When we ended conflicts in the past in Germany, Japan, Italy, Korea, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Philippines, we left military forces there, not necessarily for security, but for influence. And we chose not to do that here, and we also pulled away from, unknown to many people in this country, we pulled away from Iraq geopolitically. And it was just one of the most irresponsible strategic blunders we ever made. And we did that right on the heels of the broken promise dealing with the residents of Camp Liberty. So our record here of not doing what's right is pretty significant. And we do not have ISIS if we didn't break the promises we made in Iraq. That's the reality of it. I know for a fact, because I was there assisting General Petraeus. So our policies as it pertains to Liberty, our policies as it pertains to Iraq, has created a significant challenge in the Middle East.
What do you think of this notion of trying to enlist Iran's help now in fighting ISIS?
They want to be able, they want America, as I think they were able to achieve in terms of their geopolitical objective. They wanted a stable but weak Iraq that was under their influence and America not present. They pretty much got that. But now they have ISIS, and they don't want that. So their national interest certainly is go back to what they had before, a stable but weak Iraq, and certainly not ISIS dominating over a third of the country. So it's in their national interest to do something about ISIS. And it's in our national interest to do something about it as well. That doesn't mean for a minute, though, that we should join together. I find that morally reprehensible, that we could ever sit down across the table with them and begin to coordinate an effort towards a common objective, which is the defeat of ISIS. That can never be done because of the record of what they have done to us, the thousands of Americans that they have killed, and what they stand for as a repressive regime. We do not sit down and work with them. I understand diplomats who look at this and want to look the other way and want to push aside that record for the convenience of near-term diplomacy. But either we stand on this record and we stand for our values, or we don't. And there is no reason that we should be persuaded by that diplomatic logic to coordinate and begin to fight a war together with them. It is reprehensible to do that. We have our interests, and we should carry out those interests.
Senator Lieberman?
Let me just add a word to what General Keane said. I agree with everything he said. But when you think about it, the idea that the United States would cooperate with the current regime in Iran to fight ISIS is the ultimate in shooting ourselves in the foot, in hypocrisy. In other words, the idea would be that we would join with what our own State Department says is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism to fight terrorism? I mean, it's just ridiculous. The other thing it does, in terms of our long-term policy, is that it legitimizes the government of Iran. And look, if this ever comes to be, the Iranians are not going to do this for nothing. They're going to ask for us to bend over more in negotiations on nuclear weapons. And implicit in this is the worst thing of all. If we begin to cooperate with Iran, this regime, against ISIS, it will effectively mean abandoning what must be, by virtue of who we are as Americans, our clear goal, which is to get rid of the regime that is now tyrannizing the people of Iran. That has to be our goal.
General Keane, let me ask you, on the subject of ISIS, what does success look like? How do we, similar to the question I asked about the Iranian regime, where do we go from here and how do we get there?
Yeah. To do this, you have to have a comprehensive strategy to defeat them. Military is part of that, and it has to be. And, you know, people say, well, there's no military solution. Well, the military portion of the solution is very significant, and we cannot underestimate it. Military is always used to accomplish political objectives. Defeating Nazism was all about that, and other wars that we fought. So when people say, well, there is no military solution, that is a simplistic statement that belies what the truth really is. All that said, we do need a comprehensive strategy to undermine their ideology, to take away their money, to counter the narrative that they have out there. And we certainly have the capability to remove them from the territory in Syria, which will take longer if we're not willing to truly support a ground force. So success is regaining control of the lands that they are now in control of and returning those lands, those towns, those cities to a political regime that wants to support their people. But we will still have a radical Islamic movement in the Middle East. It'll be by another name. And the reason is because for 2 administrations now, we've never developed a comprehensive strategy to defeat radical Islam, which is really the umbrella issue. The fact of the matter is, we sit here now, 13 years after we began to really identify radical Islam as what it truly is. And we now have an administration that won't even admit what it is, won't even define it, much less have a strategy to defeat it. We need a strategy that enlists the assistance of those in the region to push back against this in their countries, and we have to assist them to do that. I think we have to provide some moral leadership to do that. We have to provide some training of their military forces to assist them. We know how to do this. Many of them do not. They have conventional militaries. We should form political and military alliances to do this. Share intelligence, share technology, share training, partnerships, etc. I'm not talking about U.S. forces going into North Africa or in the Middle East and fighting them. I'm not doing that. But I am talking about coming together against this ideology. I mean, there's a thing called political correctness going on that you can't even talk about it in the way that we should be able to talk about it. So dealing with ISIS, it's a manageable problem. And if we organize and we commit and we have the resolve to do it, we can. But there's a larger problem out there that we're not facing, and that is radical Islam. And it will come at us again by another name if we don't face up to it.
I just want to quickly add a thought which Jack's insight inspires, which I know you know, but maybe it's important that you stress it and think of yourself this way. You are frontline troops in the fight against radical Islam. I mean, you represent the alternative. The capital of radical Islam is in Tehran. In your opposition to them, and this is not vague, the program that the National Resistance, MEK, the program that I heard Mrs. Rajavi express in France that day is a program, an alternative, an Islamic alternative to radical Islam. You're part of the hope for the future. My wife was really inspired by that, our visit there. I must be honest and say for 2 reasons. She thought the program of the movement was great, and she loved the fact that the movement is led by a woman.